You're standing in snow so deep it reaches your knees, watching your breath crystallize in air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Around you, 100,000 men are trying to kill each other in a city that no longer exists. The buildings are skeletons. The ground is bodies. And somewhere in this frozen hell, you realize that what's happening here isn't really about territory anymore. It's about something darker. Something that will define how the rest of this war is fought, how millions more will die, and how an entire generation will remember what happens when ideology collides with winter. This is Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 and 1943, and what you think you know about it is probably incomplete. Because the story you learned, the one about Hitler's hubris and Soviet determination, about a single dramatic siege, misses the suffocating human reality of what it meant to fight in those conditions. It skips over the logistics of keeping 100,000 men alive in sub-zero temperatures while they're simultaneously trying to destroy each other. It doesn't explain what happens to tactics, to doctrine, to sanity itself when the thermometer drops to -30 and the enemy is in the building next door. It doesn't tell you about the smell, the sound, the mathematical certainty of death that hung over every position, every cellar, every frozen trench. And it definitely doesn't explain how this battle, this specific winter nightmare, rewrote the rules of modern warfare. We're going to look at the winter fighting at Stalingrad not as a grand strategic turning point, though it was, but as a lived experience, as a tactical problem that had never been solved before, as a psychological nightmare that broke men in ways combat veterans from other theaters couldn't imagine. We're going to understand what it actually meant to be one of those 100,000 soldiers fighting in the snow, and why this particular urban winter battle became something new in military history. A form of warfare so complete, so totalizing, so utterly without mercy, that it would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Because what happened at Stalingrad in winter wasn't just a battle. It was the invention of something we're still trying to understand. The city is burning when you arrive in late November 1942, but the flames look wrong. They're smaller than they should be, struggling against the cold. The Volga behind you is starting to freeze at the edges, great sheets of ice forming where the current slows. The temperature has dropped to -15 Celsius, and it's still early winter. You're part of the Soviet 62nd Army, clinging to a strip of ruins along the western bank of the river that's never more than a few hundred meters deep. Behind you is water that will soon be ice. In front of you is the German 6th Army, nearly 300,000 men strong, occupying 90% of the city. They've been here since September, grinding forward, building by building, and now they think they've almost won. They control the factories, they control the railway station or what's left of it. They've pushed you so far back that their forward positions are close enough to the Volga that they can hit Soviet supply boats with rifle fire. But something has changed in the last few weeks. The German advance has stopped, not because they've been defeated tactically, but because they're exhausted, because urban combat has consumed their strength, because the city they thought they'd captured has turned into a maze of strong points that refuse to die. And now it's getting cold, really cold. The strategic situation is this. Army Group South's summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue, has pushed deep into the Soviet Union, aiming for the oil fields of the Caucasus and the transportation hub of Stalingrad. Hitler, for reasons mixing strategic logic with symbolic obsession, has become fixated on capturing the city that bears Stalin's name. General Friedrich Paulus and the 6th Army have been ordered to take Stalingrad completely before winter. They've tried. They've thrown everything they have at your positions. They've reduced the city to rubble. They've killed tens of thousands of your comrades. But they haven't pushed you into the Volga. And now, in the last week of November 1942, Operation Uranus has been launched. Soviet forces north and south of the city have broken through the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. They're driving to meet each other at Kalach, west of Stalingrad. If they succeed, the entire 6th Army will be encircled, trapped. But you don't know that yet. You're in a basement on Solochnaya Street. And what you know is that it's getting colder, that there are Germans in the building across the courtyard, and that you haven't eaten anything warm in 3 days. Let's understand what made this winter at Stalingrad different from every winter battle that came before it. Armies had fought in snow before. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812 is the infamous template, a massive force destroyed by cold, hunger, and harassment. The First World War's Eastern Front saw winter combat. The Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1939–40 produced extraordinary footage of soldiers fighting in deep snow. None of this was new. But Stalingrad combined three elements that had never existed together in the same place: intense urban combat, complete encirclement, and catastrophic winter weather. Each element amplified the others. The urban terrain made it impossible to maneuver the way armies normally did in winter. You couldn't fall back to prepared positions because there was nowhere to fall back to. The encirclement meant there was no rear area, no warm rest zones, no gradual rotation out of the line. Everyone was on the front all the time because the front was everywhere. And the winter made everything resupply, medical evacuation, movement, survival exponentially harder. This created a tactical environment unlike anything in military history. A frozen city filled with soldiers who couldn't leave, fighting at ranges so close they could hear each other coughing in the next room, unable to build fires that might give away positions, unable to retreat, unable to do anything except fight and freeze and wait. The temperature in December 1942 drops to -25°C. In January 1943, it will reach -30. These aren't just uncomfortable conditions. At these temperatures, metal becomes brittle, weapons malfunction, oil freezes, vehicle engines have to be kept running continuously or they'll never start again. Frostbite becomes as dangerous as bullets. Men who fall asleep without shelter die in their sleep. Food freezes solid. Water has to be melted from snow or ice. Blood on wounds freezes before bandages can be applied. And you're doing all of this while people are trying to kill you. The German Sixth Army realizes it's been encircled on November 23, 1942. The reaction at Army Group headquarters ranges from shock to denial to a strange, fatalistic acceptance among some of the staff officers who understand what this means. Paulus requests permission to break out immediately, while the roads are still passable, before winter sets in completely. Hitler refuses. Hermann Göring promises the Luftwaffe can supply the pocket by air 250 tons per day, enough to keep the army alive. This promise is a fantasy. The Luftwaffe is already overstretched. Winter weather will limit flying days. Soviet air defenses are strengthening. The transport fleet isn't large enough. The airfields inside the pocket are coming under artillery fire. None of the math works. But the promise gives Hitler an excuse to order Paulus to hold position, to trust in relief from outside, to wait for a counterattack that will break the encirclement. So, 300,000 men settle in to defend a pocket roughly 30 miles across and 20 miles deep, centered on the ruins of Stalingrad, and they wait for rescue while winter arrives in force. For you, on the Soviet side, the encirclement is a victory, but it's not the end of the battle. It's the beginning of something worse. Because now both armies are trapped in the city, and the fighting continues through the winter with an intensity that makes the September and October battles look restrained by comparison. The Germans are desperate. They're fighting for their lives now, not for Hitler's symbolic objectives. And desperate men in urban terrain, even starving and freezing, are incredibly dangerous. The tactical reality of winter urban combat at Stalingrad develops its own terrible logic. And here's what it's like to fight in a frozen city. Movement is the first thing that changes. In normal winter warfare, armies can still maneuver, can still conduct mobile operations, can still fight the way they were trained, just slower, with more difficulty. But in Stalingrad, the rubble and the building-to-building nature of combat means you're not maneuvering in any traditional sense. You're infiltrating. Every advance is an infiltration mission. Every position is a strong point. Every building is a fortress, and the snow makes everything visible and invisible at the same time. Visible because tracks in fresh snow show where you've been, where you're going, where your supply routes are. A single soldier walking across an open courtyard leaves a trail that reveals his path for hours. A supply party moving at night leaves footprints that are still obvious at dawn. The snow makes concealment harder because every movement is recorded. Invisible, because the snow also hides things. It covers mines, it drifts against walls and creates false terrain features. It fills in shell craters and smooths over the rubble, making the ground look passable when it's not. It hides bodies, the German dead and your dead and civilians who died months ago, turning them into mounds that blend with the landscape until spring. You learn to navigate by landmarks that no longer exist. The factory you're supposed to reach burned down in September. The street you're supposed to follow is gone, replaced by a canyon of collapsed buildings. The map you have shows a city that isn't there anymore. So you navigate by memory, by whispered directions from soldiers who've been here longer, by compass bearing and dead reckoning through a landscape that looks like the surface of the moon, but colder. Sound travels differently in cold air. It's sharper, clearer, more revealing. You can hear German voices from the building next door, hear them trying to start a frozen engine, hear them arguing about rations. They can hear you. At night, the city is full of sounds, metal scraping on stone, snow crunching under boots, the distant thump of artillery, the crack of a rifle when someone's weapon discharges accidentally from the cold. Everyone is listening all the time, trying to locate the enemy, trying not to reveal themselves. And the cold itself becomes a tactical factor in ways you never imagined. Fires are suicide in forward positions. The smoke gives away your location. The heat creates infrared signatures that experienced troops can detect. The light at night draws fire like a beacon. So you don't have fires. You live in cellars and rooms and dugouts without heat, wrapped in whatever clothing you can scavenge, pressed together for warmth, trying to sleep in shifts so someone is always awake to stop anyone from lighting a fire that will get everyone killed. This means you eat frozen food, bread that's so hard you have to break it with your rifle butt, soup that's become a solid block of ice that you can't melt without fire, meat when there is meat frozen so completely that you have to thaw it inside your coat next to your body before you can chew it. Germans in the pocket will start slaughtering horses in December. By January, they'll be eating the horses raw because they can't cook them. You've been on short rations since September, so starvation isn't new to you. But the combination of hunger and cold creates a fatigue that's different from anything you've experienced before. Your body is burning calories trying to stay warm, thousands of extra calories per day that you're not eating. This is why winter warfare is so destructive even without combat. The human body can't sustain this energy deficit. Men grow weak. They get sick. Their judgment deteriorates. They move slower. They make mistakes. And mistakes in Stalingrad in winter get you killed. The weapon systems you relied on in summer behave differently now. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, the iconic Soviet weapon you're probably carrying, starts malfunctioning when the temperature drops below -20. The blowback mechanism gets sluggish. The simple blowback system that made it so reliable in normal conditions starts to fail when the metal contracts in the cold. The drum magazines, which hold 71 rounds, are heavy and awkward in the best conditions and become even more problematic now because the spring tension changes in extreme cold, causing feeding failures. You learn to keep the weapon inside your coat when you're not actively fighting, letting your body heat prevent it from freezing. The Germans have similar problems. The MP-40, their submachine gun, is more susceptible to cold than the PPSH. The Mauser Kar 98K rifle, their standard infantry weapon, works better in cold weather. Bolt-action rifles are generally more reliable in extreme temperatures, but the soldiers firing them are cold, malnourished, and increasingly desperate, which affects accuracy more than mechanical reliability. Machine guns become critical and problematic simultaneously. The Maxim M1910, your heavy machine gun, is water-cooled, which means you have to keep the cooling jacket from freezing. This requires constant attention. Some crews urinate into the jacket to keep the liquid from freezing. Urine has a lower freezing point than water. It's disgusting, and it works. The German MG-34 and MG-42 are air-cooled and fare better in some ways, but they also suffer from metal brittleness and lubrication failures in extreme cold. Artillery is harder to use. The ground freezes so hard that shells don't penetrate as deeply before exploding, which changes the fragmentation pattern. Some types of fuses don't work properly in extreme cold. The guns themselves have to be maintained constantly to prevent the recoil mechanisms from freezing. Fire missions take longer to execute because everything moves slower. But when artillery does work, it's even more terrifying than usual because the frozen ground means shrapnel bounces and skips across the surface, and there's nowhere soft to take cover. Mortars become the weapon of choice in urban winter combat. They're simple, reliable, and they drop shells almost vertically, which is perfect for urban terrain. You can set up a mortar in a courtyard, fire a dozen rounds into the building next door, and move before the Germans can respond. The Germans do the same to you. The city becomes a shooting gallery where both sides are lobbing high explosive shells at each other from behind walls, through windows, into basements, creating a constant rain of steel that never stops. And then there are grenades. Grenades work fine in winter. They're mechanical, simple, reliable. The RGD 33-stick grenade you carry works just as well at -30 as it does at +30. The problem is that in close urban combat, grenades are thrown and thrown back and thrown again. Sometimes a grenade bounces off a frozen wall at an unexpected angle. Sometimes it lands in snow and the fuse goes out. Sometimes you pull the pin and your frozen fingers fumble the throw and it lands at your feet. Urban winter combat means grenade duels through doorways, grenades tossed into rooms, grenades dropped through holes in floors, a constant exchange of blast and fragmentation in enclosed spaces where the shock wave is amplified and the fragments ricochet and nowhere is safe. This is the tactical environment. This is what the fighting is actually like. Let's zoom in on a specific position to understand how this works in practice. It's mid-December 1942. You're holding a section of the Red October factory, one of the massive industrial complexes that formed the heart of Soviet Stalingrad. The factory is a ruin, but it's a defendable ruin, a fortress of reinforced concrete, steel girders, collapsed furnaces, and machinery that's been bombed, shelled, and fought over for 3 months. Your position is in the northern workshop, 3rd floor, in what used to be a machine shop before it was destroyed. There are 8 men in your squad. You've been here for 6 days. The temperature is -22 Celsius. Across a courtyard approximately 40 meters wide, the Germans hold the southern workshop. They've been there longer than you've been in your position. They know the ground. They've fortified their side with sandbags, rubble barricades, and interlocking fields of fire. During the day, the courtyard is a killing zone. No one crosses it and lives. During the night, both sides send out small patrols to probe, to gather intelligence, to try to infiltrate the other's position. These patrols move slowly through the snow, crawling, freezing, terrified of making noise, terrified of being caught in the open if flares go up. Your orders are to hold this position and prevent the Germans from advancing further into the factory complex. Their orders are presumably the same: hold their position, prevent you from advancing. So you sit here, on opposite sides of a courtyard, and you wait. This is what most of the winter battle at Stalingrad looks like. Not dramatic assaults or heroic charges, but waiting. Waiting in cold that gnaws through every layer of clothing. Waiting with the knowledge that the enemy is close enough to hear but too dangerous to attack without preparation. Waiting for orders, for supplies, for something to change. Food arrives once a day if you're lucky. A runner brings it up from the regimental supply dump, navigating through the ruins in darkness, carrying a container of frozen soup or bread, or sometimes just a bag of grain that you're supposed to cook somehow. You take turns chipping ice from the courtyard and melting it in a container tucked inside your coat, using body heat to create water. It takes hours to melt enough ice for 8 men to drink. No one complains. This is just how things are. Sleep is difficult. The cold wakes you up. The sounds of the city wake you up: artillery in the distance, gunfire from another part of the factory, the occasional scream when someone gets hit. You sleep in shifts, 2 men awake at all times, watching the courtyard, listening for movement, ready to wake everyone if the Germans attack. But the Germans don't attack. They're as exhausted as you are, as cold, as hungry, as trapped. So you wait, and the bodies start to accumulate. There are 14 dead men in your section of the building. Soviet dead from the fighting last week before you arrived. No one has removed them. It's too dangerous to move through the building during the day, and at night there are more important things to do than carry corpses. So they stay where they fell. The cold preserves them. They look like sculptures, frozen in the positions they died in, curled up, reaching out, face down in the snow. You stop seeing them as people. They're just part of the landscape now, part of the building, no different from the rubble or the twisted metal. This is what the cold does. It makes death invisible. It preserves the evidence of violence without the decay that would normally force you to confront it. Bodies in summer rot, smell, attract attention. Bodies in winter just freeze and stay frozen and become background noise. Across the courtyard, you can see German bodies too. 5 of them in the open space, half buried in snow, killed in a failed assault 3 days before you arrived. Neither side can recover them. They'll stay there until spring, if there is a spring, if anyone survives to see it. The psychological impact of this environment is profound and cumulative. You're not just fighting the enemy, you're fighting the weather, you're fighting hunger, you're fighting disease, dysentery, typhus, trench foot, respiratory infections that turn into pneumonia in men too weak to fight them off. You're fighting exhaustion that makes it hard to think clearly, hard to react quickly, hard to care about anything except staying warm for the next 5 minutes. The Germans in the pocket are dealing with all of this and worse. They're encircled. They're not getting enough food. The Luftwaffe supply flights are delivering maybe 80 to 100 tons per day instead of the promised 250. They're running out of ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Their wounded are piling up in aid stations that have no heat, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Frostbite cases outnumber combat casualties by late December. Men are dying from the cold as often as they're dying from bullets, and they know they're not getting out. The promised relief offensive, Operation Winter Storm, launched by Army Group Dawn under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, gets within 30 miles of the pocket in mid-December before stalling. Paulus doesn't break out to meet it. Hitler won't authorize a breakout. The relief force withdraws, and that's it. That's the last chance. After that, everyone in the pocket understands that they're going to die here or surrender. And for a German soldier in 1942, surrendering to the Soviets is something you do everything possible to avoid. This creates a fatalism on the German side that makes them more dangerous, not less. They fight harder because there's no reason to preserve themselves for a future that doesn't exist. Small unit actions become savage. Assaults that would normally be called off when casualties mount continue until everyone is dead or wounded. Defensive positions becomes absolute no withdrawals, no tactical retreats, just hold until you're killed or overrun. For you, on the Soviet side, the psychological pressure is different but equally intense. You've pushed the enemy back to the Volga and then seen them encircled. You know the strategic situation has turned, but you're still in the ruins, still freezing, still fighting, and the Germans won't give up. Every building is contested, every advance costs lives. The victory that seemed so close in late November feels distant again in the frozen horror of December and January. And there's guilt. Guilt because you're alive, and so many aren't. Guilt because you sometimes hope the soldier next to you gets hit instead of you. Guilt because you've stopped feeling horror at things that should horrify anyone. You've watched friends die. You've killed men, shot them, stabbed them, beaten them to death in close combat. You've done things you can't think about without something breaking inside. And you know you'll keep doing those things because that's what survival requires. This is the psychological landscape of winter combat at Stalingrad. It's not heroic. It's not glorious. It's a grinding, soul-destroying experience that leaves permanent scars on everyone who survives it. The fighting develops its own rhythms and patterns that are specific to this environment. Night is when things happen. During the day, both sides hunker down, conserve strength, watch for opportunities. But when darkness falls, the city comes alive in a different way. Patrols go out. Infiltration attempts begin. Supply parties move. Artillery fire intensifies because the Germans can't see where the shells are landing and Soviet forward observers can't correct fire effectively, So both sides just fire at known positions, at suspected positions, at nothing in particular, hoping to get lucky. Flares go up constantly. Soviet flares, German flares, creating a stuttering illumination that turns the ruins into a nightmare landscape of moving shadows and exposed figures. If you're caught in the open when a flare goes up, you have two choices: freeze and hope you're not silhouetted against the snow, or run for cover and hope no one shoots accurately in the few seconds of light. Neither choice is good. People die in the light of flares every night, cut down mid-stride, visible for just long enough to become targets. Close combat happens suddenly and without warning. You're moving through a building, checking rooms, and suddenly there are Germans in the next room and everyone starts shooting and throwing grenades and the entire space fills with smoke and noise and confusion. These engagements last seconds. Whoever shoots first usually wins. If both sides shoot first, everyone dies. If no one can get a clear shot, it becomes a knife fight, a wrestling match, a scramble for control where training and strength matter less than desperation. The Soviets developed tactics specific to this environment. Storm groups assault teams of 8 to 10 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, and sometimes flamethrowers become the standard unit for urban winter combat. These groups clear buildings room by room, using grenades to suppress defenders, then rushing in while the Germans are stunned. It's brutal and effective. It's also suicidal. Storm group casualties are catastrophic. Men volunteer for these units knowing they probably won't survive more than a few missions. They volunteer anyway. The Germans, trapped and increasingly desperate, start conducting their own storm tactics, trying to recapture positions they've lost, trying to expand their defensive perimeter to create more space for the trapped army. These attacks are desperate, poorly supplied, and often successful initially before being pushed back by overwhelming Soviet numbers. German combat effectiveness doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes gradually: fewer heavy weapons, less ammunition, weaker men, worse coordination, but individual units can still fight well into January. And then there are the snipers. Snipers thrive in this environment. Long sight lines across rubble fields, static positions that change slowly. Cold, clear air that's ideal for long-range shooting. Both sides employ snipers extensively. The Soviets make it a propaganda point: heroes of the Soviet Union who kill dozens or hundreds of fascists from concealed positions. Vasily Zaitsev is the most famous, reportedly killing 225 Germans during the battle, including 11 enemy snipers. Whether these numbers are accurate is debatable. What's not debatable is that snipers create a constant threat that makes movement dangerous, even in areas that seem secure. German snipers are just as effective and less celebrated. They work from hidden positions in rubble, from corners of buildings, from holes in walls, waiting for targets. A Soviet officer standing up to observe the German positions. A runner carrying messages between units. A soldier who gets careless and exposes himself for too long. One shot, one kill, then silence. The psychological impact of snipers is disproportionate to their actual kill numbers. They create paranoia. They slow movement. They force everyone to assume they're being watched all the time, which is exhausting. You can't relax. You can't stand up straight. You can't do anything that might make you a target. This constant hypervigilance, combined with cold and hunger and lack of sleep, grinds away at mental health in ways that are hard to articulate. Let's talk about what happens to the encircled Sixth Army as winter progresses. By early January 1943, the pocket has shrunk. Soviet pressure from all sides is compressing the German defensive perimeter. The western edge of the pocket is being pushed east. The southern edge is collapsing slowly. The northern edge is holding barely. And inside the pocket, conditions are catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's supply effort is failing. Flights are being shot down. Winter weather grounds the transport fleet for days at a time. The airfields inside the pocket are under constant Soviet artillery fire. Ju-52 transport planes are landing, unloading, and being destroyed on the ground before they can take off again. The few supplies that do arrive are immediately consumed. There's never enough. By mid-January, German soldiers in the pocket are receiving less than 100 grams of bread per day. Horse meat is the primary protein, Then there's no more horse meat. Then there's nothing. Starvation and cold are killing more Germans than combat. Men too weak to fight remain in their positions anyway because there's nowhere else to go. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. 18,000 wounded are crammed into cellars and bunkers with minimal medical care. No heat, no food. Amputations are performed without anesthesia. Frostbite cases have turned gangrenous. Typhus is spreading. The death rate in the aid stations is approaching 100% for serious cases. Discipline begins to break down in some units. Not everywhere. Many German units maintain cohesion and fighting effectiveness almost to the end. But in others, the combination of starvation, cold, and hopelessness creates a collapse of military order. Soldiers abandon positions to search for food. Officers are ignored. Fights break out over scraps of bread. Some men commit suicide. Others simply sit down in the snow and wait to die. And the Soviet offensive continues. Operation Ring, the final Soviet operation to eliminate the pocket, begins on January 10, 1943. Soviet forces attack from all directions, pushing into the pocket, splitting it into smaller pieces, grinding down the German resistance sector by sector. The fighting is intense despite the German collapse in strength. Trapped units fight desperately because surrender still seems worse than death. But they're fighting with weapons that barely work, with ammunition that's running out, with soldiers who can barely stand. The pocket splits in two on January 25th. The southern group, trapped in the city center, is separated from the northern group, which holds the industrial districts. Communications between the two groups become sporadic. Paulus, in the southern pocket, can't coordinate with the commanders in the north. Each group is now fighting its own isolated battle, surrounded, without hope of relief or escape. For you, pressing into the pocket from outside, the German resistance is weakening but still dangerous. German soldiers fight from the rubble because they have no choice. They fight from cellars, from half-destroyed buildings, from shell craters, using their last ammunition, throwing their last grenades until they're killed or wounded or too weak to continue. Taking each position is methodical, slow, brutal work. Storm groups advance. Artillery pounds the position. The storm groups advance again. The Germans fall back to the next building, to the next block, to the next sector. The pocket shrinks daily, and everywhere there are bodies. The pocket is full of frozen corpses, German dead, Soviet dead, civilians who died in September or October and were never buried, horses that were slaughtered and partially butchered, the rest left to freeze. The snow is no longer white. It's stained with blood, oil, ash, filth. The city smells like death, even in the cold, a faint, sickly sweet smell that the frozen air can't quite suppress. This is what total war looks like. This is what a city consumed by combat becomes. The logistics of fighting in winter at Stalingrad deserve deeper examination because they reveal just how impossible the situation became. For the Soviets, supply is a constant nightmare, but at least it's possible. The Volga is your lifeline. Boats and barges cross at night, bringing ammunition, food, reinforcements. When the river starts to freeze, the ice isn't solid enough to walk on but too thick for boats to break through easily. This creates a period in late November and early December where resupply becomes extremely dangerous. Boats get stuck in ice floes. They're sitting targets for German artillery. Some sink, some turn back. The ones that make it through unload on the western bank in darkness, and then runners and supply parties have to carry everything forward through the ruins to the frontline positions. You become intimately familiar with the weight of ammunition boxes, of mortar shells, of crates of grenades. Everything has to be carried by hand because vehicles can't navigate the rubble. A resupply mission means 6 men carrying 40 kilos each, moving through terrain that's been fought over for months, navigating by memory and instinct, trying not to get lost, trying not to get shot by nervous sentries, trying not to step on mines or fall into shell craters hidden by snow. The weight doesn't get lighter as you get hungrier. If anything, it feels heavier because you're weaker. But the supplies have to reach the front, so you carry them. You carry them until your shoulders burn and your legs shake and you're convinced you can't take another step. And then you take another step anyway. When the Volga freezes solid enough to support weight, usually by mid-December, the situation improves marginally. Now trucks can drive across the ice at night. Now heavier supplies can be transported. But the ice crossing becomes a target. German artillery knows where the crossing points are. They shell them constantly. Craters form in the ice. Vehicles break through and sink. The ice road becomes littered with wrecked trucks, frozen bodies, scattered equipment. But it's still better than boats. For the Germans in the pocket, logistics become a death sentence. The Luftwaffe is trying to supply 300,000 men by air using a transport fleet that's inadequate for the task. They need to deliver 250 tons per day minimum. They're delivering less than half that on good days. On bad days, when weather grounds the flights or Soviet fighters shoot down multiple transports, they deliver almost nothing. The airlift operates from several airfields outside the pocket, primarily Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. Ju-52 transport planes, Heinkel He-111 bombers converted to cargo duty, even Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors pressed into service. They fly into Potomnik and Gumrak, the two main airfields inside the pocket. They land, unload, load wounded for evacuation, and take off again, all while under intermittent Soviet artillery fire and fighter attack. The operation is heroic and futile. Pilots fly multiple missions per day in terrible weather. Some crews don't return. Some planes are shot down by Soviet fighters. Some crash on landing because the runways are cratered or icy. Some are destroyed on the ground by artillery. And even when everything works, the tonnage delivered isn't enough. Inside the pocket, the food situation deteriorates from bad to catastrophic. The daily ration drops below starvation level in December. Soldiers are issued a slice of bread the size of a playing card and a bowl of soup that's mostly water. Horse meat becomes a luxury. When the horses are gone, soldiers eat anything they can find: leather belts boiled into a gelatinous mess, scraps of frozen vegetables dug from the ruins of warehouses, rats when they can catch them. This isn't just hunger. This is starvation. The human body can survive without food for weeks, but not while fighting in subzero temperatures. Not while carrying out physically demanding tasks like digging trenches in frozen ground or carrying wounded through rubble. The German soldiers in the pocket are burning thousands of calories per day and consuming hundreds. The weight loss is dramatic. Men who were healthy in November look skeletal by January. Their faces hollow out. Their uniforms hang loose. They move slowly, conserving energy because they don't have energy to waste. The wounded present an impossible dilemma. There are 18,000 wounded in the pocket by late January. Aid stations are packed beyond capacity. Medical supplies are exhausted. There's no morphine, no antibiotics, no anesthesia. Amputations are performed with saws and knives while the patient is held down by orderlies. Frostbite victims have blackened extremities that turn gangrenous. Some wounds can't be treated at all. Men are left to die because there's nothing that can be done for them. The Luftwaffe tries to evacuate wounded on the return flights. They pack as many as they can into the transports, but the numbers don't work. Thousands of wounded need evacuation. Only hundreds can be flown out. The selection process becomes a nightmare. Who gets to go? The ones who might survive treatment? The ones with the worst wounds? The officers? Someone has to decide, and whoever decides carries that weight forever. The cultural and ideological dimensions of the battle add another layer of complexity that shaped how both sides fought. For the Soviets, Stalingrad is existential. It's not just another city. It's Stalin's city, bearing his name, and its fall would be both a strategic disaster and a propaganda catastrophe. The order, "not a step back," has been given. Soldiers who retreat without orders are shot by blocking detachments. This isn't just propaganda, it's enforced. The NKVD operates behind the front lines, watching for cowards, for defeatists, for anyone whose commitment to the fight seems inadequate. This creates a psychological pressure that's different from what German soldiers face. You're fighting the enemy in front of you and watching for political officers behind you. You can't complain about conditions. You can't question orders. You can't show weakness or doubt. The fear of being labeled a coward or a traitor is sometimes stronger than the fear of German bullets. But there's also genuine motivation. This is your country. These are invaders who've destroyed your cities, killed your people, driven your nation to the edge of collapse. There's anger there, and hatred, and a determination that's not entirely forced by political commissars. You want to win. You want to push them back. You want to make them pay for what they've done. For the Germans, ideology works differently. They've been told they're fighting Bolshevism, fighting for European civilization, fighting a crusade against subhuman enemies. The propaganda has been relentless, and some soldiers believe it, or believed it. But by winter in the pocket, ideology matters less than survival. The grand cause fades when you're starving and freezing and watching friends die from frostbite. Yet, the Nazi ideology creates its own trap. Surrender to the Soviets is portrayed as worse than death. Stories circulate true and false about what happens to German prisoners. Torture, execution, slave labor in Siberia. Some of these stories are propaganda. Some are accurate. The result is that German soldiers fight on even when the situation is hopeless because they believe surrender means certain death anyway. This ideological framework shapes the brutality of the fighting. There's no sense on either side that the enemy deserves mercy. German soldiers have been told the Soviets are subhuman. Soviet soldiers have seen what the Germans have done to their country. The result is combat without quarter, without restraint, without the informal truces and tacit agreements that sometimes develop between enemies who see each other as fellow soldiers, rather than existential threats. Prisoners are taken, but not reliably. Sometimes a German unit surrenders and is marched to the rear. Sometimes they're shot on the spot. Sometimes Soviet soldiers surrender and receive the same treatment. The inconsistency is almost worse than consistent brutality because you never know what will happen, which makes every encounter potentially lethal regardless of whether you're trying to fight or surrender. Here's another micro-story that captures the texture of the winter battle, this one from the German perspective. You're an Obergefreiter, a senior private in the 71st Infantry Division, and it's January 20th, 1943. You've been in the pocket since November, and you're not sure anymore why you're still fighting. The rational part of your brain understands that you're going to die here. Everyone is going to die here. The relief force failed. The airlift isn't working. The Russians are closing in from every direction. And yet here you are, in a half-collapsed apartment building on the edge of what used to be Red Square, holding a position that doesn't matter for reasons you can't articulate. There are 4 men with you. There were 12 this morning. The others were killed in the Soviet assault that started at dawn, a storm group that came through the building next door and cleared 3 floors before you stopped them. You stopped them because you had a machine gun and they didn't expect you to have ammunition left. You do. Not much. 2 belts, maybe 300 rounds. You're saving them. You haven't eaten in 2 days. The last resupply you received was 4 days ago, a quarter loaf of bread split between 12 men and a container of soup that was frozen solid. You've been melting snow for water and drinking it, which gives you dysentery, which makes the hunger worse because your body can't absorb what little food you do get. You're cold all the time, not the kind of cold you felt back home in winter, but a deep, penetrating cold that lives in your bones and never goes away, even when you're pressed against the other men for warmth. Your feet haven't been warm since December. You know you have frostbite. You can feel it, the numbness, the burning sensation when you try to move your toes. You've heard stories about frostbite victims who have their feet amputated without anesthesia. You've decided you'd rather die than experience that, which is fortunate because you're probably going to die anyway. The Soviets will attack again tonight. They always attack at night. They'll come through the ruins with submachine guns and grenades, and you'll fire the machine gun until it's empty or jams, and then you'll use your rifle, and then you'll use your pistol, and then you'll use your hands. And maybe you'll stop them again. Or maybe they'll overrun your position and you'll die in a cellar in Stalingrad, thousands of kilometers from home, for reasons that stopped making sense weeks ago. But you keep fighting. Not because you believe in the mission anymore. Not because you think there's any chance of victory. You fight because the men next to you are fighting. Because stopping would mean admitting that everything up to this point has been for nothing. Because on some level that you can't fully explain, even to yourself, it's easier to keep going than to quit. This is what the German experience in the pocket becomes by late January. A mixture of fatalism, stubborn pride, fear of surrender, and simple momentum men who've already suffered so much that giving up feels impossible even when continuing is suicidal. Paulus surrenders on January 31, 1943, one day after Hitler promotes him to field marshal. The promotion is Hitler's way of suggesting that Paulus should commit suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, but Paulus chooses to live. He walks into Soviet captivity with what remains of his southern pocket. 91,000 German soldiers surrender with him. The northern pocket holds out for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, the last German resistance in Stalingrad ends. Some units surrender. Some keep fighting until they're annihilated. A few small groups try to break out through Soviet lines. Almost none succeed. Of the 300,000 German and Axis soldiers who were trapped in the pocket in November, only 91,000 live long enough to surrender. The rest died of wounds, starvation, cold, or disease. Of those 91,000 who surrender, only 6,000 will survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany after the war. The rest will die in POW camps from continued starvation, disease, and the accumulated trauma of Stalingrad. The Soviet casualties for the Battle of Stalingrad from the defensive phase in September through the winter fighting to the final elimination of the pocket in February exceed 1 million. This number includes killed, wounded, missing, and those who died of disease or cold. The civilian population of Stalingrad, which was roughly 400,000 when the battle began, is reduced to a few thousand survivors huddled in cellars and ruins. The city is destroyed, not damaged. Destroyed. 99% of the buildings in central Stalingrad are either completely demolished or structurally unsound. The factories are scrap metal and rubble. The residential districts are moonscapes. The Volga riverbank is a graveyard of sunken barges, destroyed boats, and equipment that was pushed into the water during the retreat. It will take decades to rebuild, and for the soldiers who fought there in winter, the experience will define the rest of their lives. Because what happened at Stalingrad in winter changed how armies thought about urban combat, about winter warfare, about what was possible and what was survivable. Before Stalingrad, military theory held that cities were difficult to attack but could be bypassed. That winter weather would create operational pauses during which neither side could effectively fight. That encircled forces would surrender quickly rather than face annihilation. Stalingrad disproved all of these assumptions. It demonstrated that urban terrain could be held even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even when supply lines were cut, as long as defenders were willing to pay the cost. It showed that winter didn't create an operational pause, it just changed the nature of combat, making it slower, more intimate, more psychologically destructive. It proved that ideological conviction or fear of surrender could keep armies fighting long past the point where military logic said they should quit. The tactical lessons were absorbed by every major army. The Soviets learned that urban combat required specialized assault units, overwhelming artillery support, and a willingness to accept horrific casualties to take defended positions. The Germans learned that encircled forces needed to break out immediately, before winter, before supply lines became critical vulnerabilities, before hope died. The Western Allies, watching from a distance, learned that urban combat in winter was a form of warfare they wanted to avoid at almost any cost. But beyond the tactical and strategic lessons, Stalingrad established something else, a psychological benchmark for what modern industrial warfare could demand. It became the standard by which other battles were measured. Berlin, Manila, Hue, Grozny, every subsequent urban battle was compared to Stalingrad, and usually found less intense, less total, less completely destructive. The veterans of Stalingrad, Soviet and German, both carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke about it. The trauma was too deep, too personal, too far outside civilian experience to explain. How do you describe what it was like to fight in -30-degree weather in a city that no longer existed? How do you explain that you did things you can't reconcile with your self-image as a human being? How do you tell your children that you survived by stepping over frozen corpses, by eating food you don't want to identify, by becoming something you didn't recognize? You don't. You stay quiet. You wake up from nightmares you won't describe. You flinch at sudden noises. You can't tolerate crowds or enclosed spaces or the smell of certain things. And you carry the knowledge that you were part of something so extreme, so absolute, that no one who wasn't there can ever fully understand. Here's a micro-story that captures something essential about the winter fighting at Stalingrad, one moment among thousands that illustrates what this battle was. It's January 15th, 1943. You're part of a storm group attacking a German position in the Univermag department store in the center of the city. The building is 5 stories of reinforced concrete that's been fought over for weeks. The Germans are in the basement. Your mission is to clear them out. You go down the stairs in darkness, one man at a time, feeling your way because flashlights would make you targets. The stairs are icy. The walls are frozen. You can hear German voices below. Hear them arguing about something in a language you don't speak. Your squad leader tosses 2 grenades down the stairwell. The explosions are deafening in the enclosed space. Everyone rushes down while the Germans are stunned. The basement is larger than you expected. It's a storage area, full of frozen goods, shelving units, and shadows. You can't see the Germans, but you can hear them moving. Someone fires a burst from a submachine gun. Ricochets spark off the concrete. Everyone drops to the floor. Then its chaos muzzle flashes in the darkness. The concussion of grenades, someone screaming, the smell of cordite and something else you can't identify. It's over in 30 seconds. 5 Germans dead. 2 of your squad wounded. 3 Germans surrendering, hands up, terrified. They're boys, younger than you, thin to the point of emaciation, wearing uniforms that are falling apart. One of them is crying. Your squad leader asks if any of them speak Russian. One does, haltingly. He says they haven't eaten in 4 days. He says they're supposed to be defending the building, but there's no one to defend it from except you because the rest of their company is dead or surrendered. He says, please don't shoot them. Don't. No one shoots them. You take them prisoner, send them up the stairs with a guard, and keep moving through the basement to make sure it's clear. And in the back corner, behind a collapsed shelf, you find 20 German soldiers who've been dead for weeks, frozen solid, stacked like firewood. Someone was saving them for later, you realize. For food, because that's what it's come to in the pocket. Cannibalism. Not widespread, not official, but happening. Because when there's no food, and you're freezing and you've lost hope, some men will do anything to survive one more day. You don't report this. Neither does anyone else in your squad. There's no point. It doesn't change anything. It's just another horror in a battle made entirely of horrors. Another thing you'll carry silently for the rest of your life. Another memory that will surface at random moments decades later and make you stop whatever you're doing and just breathe for a minute until it passes. This is Stalingrad in winter. Not the strategic turning point you learned about in school, but this humans reduced to their most basic survival instinct, fighting in conditions that shouldn't allow life, doing things that shouldn't be possible, and somehow continuing day after day until one side can't continue anymore. The medical situation in the pocket by late January represents its own special horror that needs to be understood to grasp the full scope of what happened. Inside the German pocket, the 18,000 wounded aren't just statistics. They're men crammed into cellars and bunkers designed for maybe 100. They're lying on concrete floors without mattresses, without blankets, without heat. The aid stations have run out of bandages, so wounds are wrapped in paper, in cloth torn from uniforms, in nothing at all. They've run out of morphine, so amputations are performed while the patient screams and thrashes. They've run out of antibiotics, so infections spread unchecked. Gangrene is the most common condition. Frostbite that wasn't treated early enough turns gangrenous. Wounds that would heal in normal conditions become infected and then gangrenous. The smell in the aid stations is overwhelming: rotting flesh, human waste, unwashed bodies, death. The doctors and medics are working with frozen hands, often without adequate light, trying to save lives with no resources and no hope of resupply. Triage becomes a daily nightmare. Who gets treated? Who gets pain medication from the dwindling supply? Who gets to be evacuated on the few planes that still land? The decisions are impossible. A soldier with a stomach wound will die without surgery. but there's no way to perform surgery. A frostbite victim needs immediate amputation or he'll die of sepsis, but the amputation will kill him because he's too weak from starvation. A head injury case is unconscious and dying, but he's using a blanket that could keep someone else alive. The doctors make these decisions knowing that most of the men they're treating will die regardless of what they do. The role of medicine shifts from healing to managing death, to making it less painful when possible, to simply documenting who died and how. On the Soviet side, medical care is marginally better but still overwhelmed by the volume of casualties. Field hospitals behind the lines treat thousands of wounded. They have more supplies than the Germans, but supplies are still limited. The cold is just as destructive. Wounded soldiers die during evacuation across the Volga because the journey in freezing temperatures is too much for bodies weakened by injury and blood loss. Soviet military medicine in 1942-43 is pragmatic and brutal in its efficiency. If a soldier can be saved and returned to duty, maximum effort is applied. If a soldier's wounds are too severe or recovery will take too long, resources are allocated elsewhere. This isn't cruelty, it's triage under impossible conditions. Every bandage used, every dose of medicine administered, every surgeon's hour spent is taken from finite resources in a war that's consuming everything. Frostbite is treated with rough effectiveness. Frozen limbs are thawed, assessed, and amputated if necessary. The amputees are sent to rear hospitals if they survive, often to be fitted with crude prosthetics and returned to non-combat roles. The Soviet military cannot afford to lose manpower permanently, so even disabled veterans are recycled into the war effort somehow. The psychological casualties on both sides are enormous, but mostly undocumented. Battle fatigue, shell shock, what would later be called PTSD, these conditions are recognized but not treated as medical emergencies. A soldier who breaks down is sometimes shot for cowardice, sometimes transferred to a less demanding role, sometimes simply ignored until he recovers enough to function. Mental health care as a concept barely exists. You're expected to endure, to continue, to suppress whatever is breaking inside you until the war is over. The surrender of the 6th Army in early February 1943 is reported across the world. Soviet newspapers proclaim a great victory. The Western Allies see it as proof that Germany can be beaten. In Berlin, the Reich declares 3 days of national mourning and broadcasts somber music on the radio. Goebbels uses the defeat to intensify propaganda about the necessity of total war, about fighting to the last rather than surrendering to the Bolsheviks. But inside the Soviet Union, among the soldiers who fought through the winter at Stalingrad, there's less triumphalism than you might expect. There's relief that it's over. There's exhaustion. There's grief for the dead, who outnumber the survivors by an incomprehensible margin. There's satisfaction that the enemy has been destroyed, but it's a grim satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge of what it cost. And there's the understanding that the war isn't over, that this was one battle, one city, one winter, that there will be more battles, more cities, more winters before this is finished, that you're going to have to keep doing this, keep fighting, keep freezing, keep losing friends for months or years to come. The Soviet military begins analyzing the battle immediately. Reports are compiled, tactics are studied, lessons are distributed to other armies. The winter urban combat techniques developed at Stalingrad will be used in the assault on Berlin in 1945. The storm group tactics will become standard doctrine. The understanding that urban combat requires overwhelming numbers, specialized units, and a tolerance for casualties will shape Soviet operational planning for the rest of the war. The Germans also learn. They learn that holding cities is a death sentence. They learn that encircled forces need air supply operations that are actually feasible, not fantasies promised by Göring. They learn that winter creates vulnerabilities that operational planning must account for. These lessons come too late to change the outcome of the war, but they inform German defensive doctrine in subsequent battles. And for the historians, the journalists, the filmmakers who will tell the story of Stalingrad in the decades to come, the winter battle becomes the defining image. Not the initial assault, not the house-to-house fighting of September and October, But the winter, the snow, the cold, the trapped army slowly dying, the Soviet forces pressing in from all sides, the final surrender. This is the Stalingrad that enters cultural memory, the Stalingrad of frozen soldiers and burning ruins and absolute devastation. Because it was all of those things. Because the winter fighting at Stalingrad was one of the most intense, most sustained, most psychologically destructive battles in human history. Because 100,000 soldiers fought in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance, and most of them didn't survive. Because what happened there was so extreme that it became a reference point, a metaphor, a symbol of what total war means when ideology and winter and urban combat converge in one place. Let's end with what this means. The Battle of Stalingrad, particularly the winter phase from November 1942 to February 1943, established parameters for urban winter warfare that remain relevant. Modern military forces study Stalingrad when planning urban operations. The tactical problems, how to supply troops in a contested urban environment, how to maintain fighting effectiveness in extreme cold, how to conduct offensive operations when the enemy is willing to fight to annihilation, haven't been solved. They've been mitigated, addressed with better equipment and better doctrine, but the fundamental challenges remain. Because cities are still hard to attack, winter still makes everything harder, and determined defenders still exact horrific costs from attackers, no matter how overwhelming the numbers or how superior the technology. But Stalingrad also represents something broader about the Second World War. It represents the point where the mythology of German military superiority broke against the reality of Soviet determination and Soviet willingness to pay any cost to win. It represents the moment when the strategic initiative shifted permanently in the East. It represents, for the Soviet Union, a validation of the sacrifices made, the losses endured, the suffering accepted in pursuit of victory. For the individuals who fought there, it represents something more personal. It represents the worst experience of their lives, the hardest thing they ever did, the thing they survived when so many didn't, and the guilt that comes with that survival. It represents a before and after Stalingrad, and after Stalingrad, and the understanding that the person who went into that city in the autumn of 1942 isn't the same person who came out in the spring of 1943. The city was rebuilt. New buildings rose on the foundations of the old ones. The factories reopened. The Volga still flows. Life returned to Stalingrad, renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization. Monuments were erected, museums were opened. Veterans returned for anniversaries, fewer each year, standing in squares that used to be battlefields, looking at buildings that used to be ruins, trying to explain to their grandchildren what happened here. But the winter of 1942-43 remains. It remains in the historical record, in the casualty statistics, in the photographs of frozen soldiers and destroyed buildings. It remains in the memories of those who were there, fading now as the last veterans die. It remains as a standard against which other battles are measured and usually found less extreme. And it remains as a reminder that in total war, in ideological war, in industrial war between modern states with mass armies and entire populations mobilized, there are no limits to what humans will do to each other. That cities can become slaughterhouses. That winter doesn't stop war, it just makes war worse. That 100,000 soldiers fighting in the snow in a destroyed city is not an aberration or an accident, but a logical consequence of the kind of war that was being fought. This is what Stalingrad teaches us. Not just the tactics or the strategic outcome, but the deeper truth about what modern warfare demands and what humans are capable of enduring. It's a truth that's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit easily into narratives of heroism or villainy. It's just the fact of what happened, stripped of mythology, presented in all its brutal clarity. 100,000 soldiers fought in the snow at Stalingrad. Most of them died. The ones who survived carried the experience forever, and the battle itself became something more than history. It became a touchstone, a reference point, a moment when the limits of human endurance and human cruelty were tested and found to be almost incomprehensibly vast. That's the story that needs to be told. Not the simplified version, not the propaganda version, but the human version. The version that recognizes the suffering, honors the sacrifice, acknowledges the horror, and refuses to look away from the truth of what happened when ideology and winter and urban combat met in one place and created hell on earth. If this kind of historical deep dive speaks to you, if you want to understand more about the human experiences behind the battles we think we know, consider subscribing.